uh, body of work practice that states and cities and counties and businesses all over the country use that have a huge influence on our lives. Um, COVID-19, we were all watching the Johns Hopkins website and getting information from Johns Hopkins, and they were informing us with a map and a dashboard that told us what the world looked like. And the folks who were creating that map had access to all the information um, that we could not all that we could want, but lots of information, and they chose what to show based on their experiences, their expertise, their perspectives all coming together, telling them that we needed to see these aggregate numbers at city levels, at county levels, and what their experience and expertise did not tell them was that we might want to consider race as a factor. And though the data was there and available, they weren't tracking it. And that insight was informing what folks were doing and what the work looked like. So my organization works with the notion that if the GIS community of practice and the GIS community of practitioners better reflect our communities and have a focus on racial justice, we won't have mishaps like that. Some of the motivation for our work, I remember I was a GIS professional for many years, and during Hurricane Katrina, folks would come on the news, and I'll never forget this one guy said, we know about how many people are going to die, and we know where they are. And I knew they would because they'd be using GIS. And some of the leading GIS organizations that produce software have professionals, just like the Red Cross shows up. Sometimes before they get there, the GIS professionals are there helping to plan and figure out where to deploy resources, how much of a resource to deploy, in which areas. And they almost never are focused on racial equity, disparities. They almost never have people at the table who look like me. And that work almost always lands on Black and brown people in ways that were unexpected or unanticipated. So it's our mission to try to create a more racially just world, knowing that this body of practice, this body of work is always out there, always acting. It's the urban planners who are in the city planning agencies and all the counties and local government agencies. Please sit at the tip of the table if there's a spot. All are welcome. So in our work with the state, we're here to help make sure that as all of the state agencies are working together and in collaboration with community to make sure that all of the systems, and I'll talk about these things, that systems that individuals, families, and communities need to thrive, to prosper. All these systems that are constantly threatened by systems of oppression, like racism, sexism, homophobia, all working together in concert, overlapping to create different kinds of disparities, that folks have the data and the geospatial analysis and maps that they need to ensure equity. And there are lots of ways that you can use GIS for racial equity and social justice. Now, when I say GIS, please think geography or digital geography. And in the same way that folks said, it'd be great if because we don't like Black people, if we kept them over here, separate from other folks, if we segregate them, then our society will prosper in the way we want it to. Or in the same way that people said that we want to, break up cities. Now that all this great migration is happening and people are also immigrating from other countries, now this is happening, we want to ensure that our country remains the way we wanted it to. Let's do this redlining thing and separate communities by race and immigration status and put the folks that we find undesirable in the communities that we don't intend to prosper. And in the same ways that people carved up cities and counties by deploying highways in ways that would benefit some while harming others, well, we can use GIS and geography to create change, to assess the wrongs and then to identify and address those inequities. So these are all terms, I hope I moved on from inclusion, but these are all terms that we can think about as just naturally having a geographic context. just naturally having a location context. So inclusion, I think we can all agree, as we heard earlier, is about having access to a space and resources to prosper in that space. But when you think about a space, you might want to think about places, communities, neighborhoods, geography. Even sometimes thinking about a space in terms of, I remember a building I used to work in downtown Philadelphia, where certain floors were for certain people who worked at certain levels, and other floors were for other people. And sometimes those people wouldn't move down from their spaces into other spaces, or if they did show up in another space, that presence, that presence of that privileged person like mattered. This is still, it's all geography. That's three-dimensional geography. Like space, location is always mattering. And when we talk about belonging, we're talking about inclusion, and we're talking about the same kind of access and resources to prosper, but without the need for assimilation. But again, space matters. Geography, location matters. And when I think about applying an equity lens to try to understand how people understand, how people experience the world, how they experience services, the outcomes they receive as a result, how investments that organizations make in communities will differ in their impact for people. Well, it's important. If space always matters, if location always matters, then right alongside race, ethnicity, caste, tribe, religion, immigration status, language, sexual orientation, all of these other social characteristics that are usually the targets for discrimination based on different systems of oppression. Well, think about how they all shift and differ based on location. So sometimes when I talk about this, I'll say to people that sometimes people will see me as a man. And when they do, all of the sort of benefits of sexism will start to pile in front of me. And sometimes they'll see me as young. And then the benefits of ageism will start to pile in front of me. And in those times when people see me as a young man, well, now they may be thinking that there's lots of energy and exuberance and great ideas coming to flow. And those are like different kinds of benefits, right? From just being young or just being a man. But more often than not, people see me as Black. And when they see me as a young Black man, well, now the burdens of racism at the intersection of all of those other systems of oppression, that again, like sometimes will benefit people differently, are maybe creating different kinds of experiences for me. And you can imagine that as an individual, and I'll just continue to keep the focus on myself if it's easier, it matters how people perceive me when I'm moving through my neighborhood, which is predominantly Black, or it might matter it may matter if I'm driving to work and moving through predominantly white areas. And sometimes when I am traveling in Europe, again, location and national context will create situations where, maybe someone sees me as an American tourist coming to spend my money for resources into their country. And other times they'll see me as an African immigrant who's coming to take their resources. So all of these aspects of our identity matter to these systems that oppress, but also privilege. But so does location. It all shifts and moves and changes. Even the notion of race will be different across the country, will be different, from one state to another, will be different from one country to another. So location is always this important factor that I just want people to realize was always there. And in some ways, some of you always realize it was there, and maybe we don't always talk about it in this way when we're talking about this stuff. Now, as an icebreaker, because I've been talking a bit, I want to do a pop quiz. I don't remember what's in this pop quiz. I know that it is about the US Census, though, and about race and ethnicity. So in the US Census, as far as the federal government is concerned, are race and ethnicity based on biology? As far as the federal government is concerned, what do you think? Show of hands if you think it is. If you think that the federal government thinks it is. Can people online hear us? I want to make sure. If you're online, you can put a thumb up. Okay, so no one thought that, and you're right. Even the oh wait, sorry, saw a comment. Cool. Just acknowledging some of the content in the chat. So actually, the federal government says that these categories, that they are categories, they represent a social political construct that is designed for collecting data on race and ethnicity of broad population groups across the country based not on anthropological or scientific or not scientifically based either. It's social political. It's a social political construct. And those categories that are defined in the US Census may not be the categories that we all move through the world with or that we move through our communities. You know, that's a good question. I don't know when it changed, but this is a statement as far back as 1997 when they reestablished the categories. But even in the documents that I saw, you know, prior to that, it was still the notion of a social political construct for quite some time. It's like the thing you got to think about is like in 1950, maybe, you know, the other thing is like Negro was still a valid descriptor in the census according to 1997. But in, let's say, 1950, 1930, 1940, what did Negro mean at that time? You know, it didn't, it wasn't talking about people as human beings, right? So when did it change? It's, I think, a really good, really important question. I don't think that word ever made it to the census, but in terms of federal government, state and local government, how they were considering people at different periods of time, it would be interesting to figure out. Maybe I'll do it like over a break, figure out, you know, when did the shift start to happen such that all of these categories conceptually represented in the hearts and minds and policies of the nation, people, and not some folks being subhuman. Anyway, more stuff in this pop quiz. What about Middle Eastern and North African people in the U.S. Census? Are they accounted for in the U.S. Census? When you think about the categories that you've been presented with, how many people think that they are not accounted for? I'm terrible at like visual math, but let's say that was like at least half. Maybe it was most people in the room. How are we feeling online? If you all know how to put thumbs up, see a couple thumbs. And this view of it looks crazy. Can you open up? Oh, maybe you don't have access to online. Anyway. Someone believes it changed to include Middle Eastern and North African groups on the 2020 census. Well, according to the results of this pop quiz, white, and this again has been at least since 1997. I believe the description prior also, I want to say it was in the 70s that this changed. At least the last time it changed significantly was in the 70s when Middle Eastern people sued the country for the right to be white. Why waste time? Why waste time in the ways that Italians and Irish people had to suffer and prove their whiteness by harming, you know, Black and brown communities? Why waste time? They sued the country, won, and had a lot of influence at the time. So a white person is a person who has origins in any of the original peoples, whatever that means, of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. So they've been accounted for quite a while. And I really want you to think about those categories that you get presented with as categories. They could say A, B, C, D, E. They could say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The trick of it is read the descriptions. Read the descriptions and find where the U.S. government sees you in those descriptions. And what they're trying to get at is, historically, how has your family been harmed, oppressed, or benefited from the system of oppression that we talk about as racism? This is what they're trying to get at and try to understand by asking you about your origins in this regard. Sometimes they're trying to get at those bits of information, so that they can create policy that will harm some people. And other times, we have a different kind of administration who's trying to get at information that'll help them close gaps. Okay. How many ethnicity categories are in the US Census? How many ethnicity categories do we think there are? How many people think that there are more than 20? More than 20 ethnicity categories in the US Census? Nobody in the room thinks there's more than 20? Oh, somebody in the room. How many think that there are more than 10? Okay, 2 or 3 people think there's more than 10. Get the I do. Well, how many people think there are at least 5? There's got to be at least 5, right? A few more people. Come on, there's got to be at least 3, right? How many people think there's at least 3? Okay, there are. Let's see how many there are. There's 2. There's only 2, and they are Hispanic or Latino as one category, and non-Hispanic or Latino. Why is this? Why is this the thing that's happening? Ethnicity in the US Census is separate from race. So in fact, they're not doing that. I won't say what go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Could it be that they also wanted to separate the indigenous peoples of South and Central America from the African and the white colonizers?
That's an interesting idea. What I know of there's a cheat sheet at the end where people can go and find the information about the details. But what I understand off the top of my head about the categories themselves, I would say no, because the way the categories are broken up, they don't even care. They don't even care about that, because what they're trying to understand is how the United States has harmed or benefited people based on the federal level influence of things, influence at the federal level, how racism has played out, right? They're not necessarily trying to get at, do people belong? Do people feel like they have a sense of belonging? They want to either know where they have harmed or where they have benefited, and it's either to further racism or to address racism, depending on who's in charge. Now, why I say that's not the case, I'm going to get the category wrong, but Native American is a racial category in the United States. It's considered a race as far as the US Census and the federal government is concerned, and it does not account for indigenous groups outside of the United States. It does not account for it. It seems to not matter, or just not be concerned with folks who are from indigenous communities from outside of the United States. So if you thought about, let's say, folks who are from Australia, indigenous people who are, from tribes and countries indigenous to Australia, that part, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in the context. I have to look. Right, it's not even those. Right, I went far, but yes, it doesn't even care about that. Or North America and Canada, right? Like that border that they call, right, doesn't even matter. That border that they call the United States is what they're concerned about. It's a social political construct.
So is this to deal with indigenous Mexican populations as
The,
southwestern
what,
US was Mexico?
what folks believe, to sort of get at what you're talking about, is that, well, really, when you think about it, the last category of folks who have immigrated, folks who have origins in the in Europe. You know, when we think about folks who have origins in Europe who are in the United States in significant numbers, there's one last group that hasn't fully been considered white. There's one last group, and it's the population that you're talking about. It's the folks who are from who are categorized as Hispanic or Latino, right? So this is a way so that they can check white, grow the white population in the country, and at the same time check a category that colloquially we talk about as brown. Now, in the politics of the systems that we talk about as the federal government and the other government entities that are influenced by it, brown in that way doesn't really matter. It's not accounted for in any way other than saying that, well, we can look at the people who choose Hispanic or Latino, we can call them, maybe we can call them brown, but they don't, we can call them Hispanic or Latino. Even in Hispanic or Latino, it includes people who are Hispanic by way of coming from Spain. So if you are from Spain Spanish, you also would be Hispanic or Latino. So it'd be hard to really figure out just by looking at that. That's one big category where people are coming from. So when we say that the country is increasingly becoming more brown, we don't simultaneously say that the country is becoming less white. In fact, when you look at the results from the 2020 census, the country might be whiter than it's been in a really long time, while at the same time, simultaneously having this flexible conversation around racial and ethnic identity, which isn't necessarily a conversation they have at the federal government level. You can also say that because people are choosing Hispanic or Latino, and we can talk about people who are choosing Hispanic or Latino as brown, that the country is becoming increasingly more brown. But the population that's growing of all of the folks who would fall into the categories that we would think of as Black or brown, the fastest, the steadily growing category would be Hispanic or Latino. The other categories are shrinking a bit. Black is shrinking a bit. Asian populations are shrinking a bit. I don't really know whether or not Native American populations are shrinking at all. But anyway, like these data are tools of this system that we call the federal government. And then that's sort of like in a fairly pure way of talking about it. But now let's think about the people who work in the federal government at all levels. Do you think that they see it any differently than you do? Do you think that they have any clarity around this stuff any more so than you all do? Do you think they wake up in the morning and they read this documentation wait, actually, let me see if there's any more. Yeah, so you can scan this and get a link to the document that defines all this stuff. Do you think they think about this stuff? And then when you think about the geographers and the GIS professionals who work in the space, the geospatial professionals, who are the folks who are responsible for aggregating the data and sharing that data, these are folks who are in part responsible for the folks who encounter that category of two or more races, that some people start to believe maybe that's who I am. I am two or more races. Well, when it comes down to actually putting the data into practice and sharing the data, even though this document says to not to sort of minimize people down to any one category and allow for people to identify in all the categories that they have identified with. And that has been the case well before 2020, right? Like there's actually this idea that in 2020, the census changed in a way that let people choose more than one category. I think it was the census short form that changed to make it easier for people to find that they can choose more than one category. But at least since 1997, you've been able to choose all of their categories. And the data has existed for all these folks. In 2020, they started producing maps so that you could say, instead of just, so the common practice that those folks who who probably shared some of the same ideas about race and ethnicity that in this room we all did. Those folks, when they aggregated the data, they put for the categories that are of each of the sort of racial groups, Black, Asian, so on, you could only be in that aggregate if you only chose one race. If you chose more than one race, you're no longer in that aggregate. You're in the 2 or more races aggregate. Well, in 2020, they shared out data. It wasn't that they didn't collect it in 2020. They shared out the data for easier consumption, such that whatever else you chose, if you chose Black, you're in the Black category. If you chose Asian, you're in the Asian category. So you can get so you can more easily have this data available to get a better sense for how people are experiencing racism in the framing that the federal government is using. I don't know if that was helpful at all, interesting at all. I still ended up talking a lot. Any other thoughts on this stuff? Anybody feel like they learned something that they just didn't know before, but that they're shocked by? Was anybody shocked or surprised significantly by what I just shared?
Yeah. I think that Clinton just gave a really good breakdown of like the census and one of the main sources to do this work. And I know today we are going to focus on working on, what are some determinants of equity of the data that we have. I also just want to put a footnote out for what data might we need to start collecting, right? So what we're talking about, when we talk about race, it's been collected in certain ways by the census and even the state, in some of our even states. Right, and so racism, we need to start collecting race data based on how the system of racism treats, right? There's a difference between my personal racial identity, which is usually what we ask when we ask what's your race. And then sometimes we've seen it, I've seen it, where there's 2 ethnicity categories, but in other places we're asking ethnicity and there's a long list because we're wanting to really know what people identify from their ethnicity perspective. But racism, the system of racism works on how I'm read and treated. So in the West Coast, so that's why location matters, I'm read and treated as Black. But when I'm on the East Coast, I'm read and treated as Latin, Latina, they think I'm from Puerto Rico a lot. And so they'll come up and start speaking Spanish to me. So it's not about my personal racial identity. The system of racism reads and treats people under a few racial categories, even if that's not your ethnic background, and you're doing it. And so if I'm looking to look at disparity or looking at things, I want to know, how is the system of racism reading and treating folks? I could simply ask the question, here are the 5 racial areas. How often are you ready to speak this stuff? Right? I could be 100% of the time because we're really listening to the data about disparities around race to eradicate racism. Then we need to ask everyone to collect that. We might have a reason to ask racial identity and absolutely a reason to ask, ethnic identity, because we might want to be able to do things where people belong, understand what's going on. I might want to make sure I have things that I'm culturally competent. So I need to know those things. But to me, there's a big chasm around, the way we collect race is racial identity. And that's not how people identify personally, is not how the system of racism works. So again, I just want to put that footnote out there as we're thinking, because just like the conversation today, earlier this morning, was we have this place of belonging, right? We have this place where we want to be. And today we're going to talk about, the data that we have. So I always say, we need to ask the questions that are important to do the work. And if we have the data, we run the analysis. And if we don't have the data, we need to start collecting it. So today, as we do this workshop, we're going to be trying to focus on things that we have the data for, so we can run and start giving these determinants of equity as measured today. But if we have time, and if we want, either way, I want you all to put a footnote in of hey, how should we start, and what data might we start collecting, and how might we have forms or questions that we ask in our departments and agencies so that we can actually do that work as well.
I was going to talk about that too, and get really practical about it. So earlier when I was describing how things might change for me as I move through spaces,
I never said because of how I see myself, right? And we never want to see police officers who brutalize Black people or brown people. We never actually see that. Hey, before I harm you, you identify as Black, you identify as brown. Like, they're not asking that question, right? They're making a decision based on what they perceive. And I also described, how how my circumstances may differ from experiences where I live, experience while I'm commuting, experiences when I'm in the workplace. We can talk about experiences when you are in a workplace as someone being served, right, as a customer, going to the hospital. So, while very often it is a common practice to look at things like food security by is there a grocery store there? Check. It's in proximity, they can get to it. Sometimes people can step up and say, in that grocery store, are the prices at a level that people in that community can afford? Okay, check, they are. Or, we're looking at prenatal health and we want to make sure that certain prenatal services are available in whether they be health care specific locations or their recreational sites, because we get a little creative and we see that they're there, check. What we need to do is asking what happened when a person went into those facilities, right? So the study revealed to many the experiences that Black people are having for a long time, that when Black women go to the ER, they were less likely to receive the pain medication at the same level that everyone else is receiving, everyone else, and especially white women relative to Black women. Well, I remember talking to my mother, my sister, and my niece. My mother, who had failure, diabetes, my niece, who had a rare form of cancer, my sister, who has an autoimmune illness, and they all would be talking about their experiences in the hospital when they're talking to doctors. And from time to time, I would go on these appointments, and my mother had gotten hepatitis, the curable kind, and really quickly she did her research and found out, what she needed to do to get that cure. She goes to her doctor, who's an expert, and says, "Hey, what do we do to get on track with this?" And he tells her she's moving too fast and to slow her roll effectively. And he tells her this for very nearly a year. And then she goes into the doctor's office and they're looking at her numbers, and her numbers are looking really bad. And another doctor asked, "Well, why haven't you taken care of hepatitis still? Why haven't you gotten treatment?" My mother is, really struggling. She's hurt in this conversation. So she tells me about this, and I attend the next appointment. And sure enough, the doctor goes in that path of why didn't you? And so while I was there, I played back for them the experiences she had over all that time. He wasn't apologetic, but he moved past it, and they got her what she needed. But when my niece would complain about pain from the cancer that she had growing in her stomach, pressing up against her other organs, her mother would start to tell her it's not that serious. My grandmother would start to tell her it's not that serious. But they had a whole history of going to the doctors and having the doctors tell them it's not that serious. And so now they're sort of passing it on. But these experiences that we don't capture about how people interact with services, how services interact with them, did you actually get the care that was available? Or did someone treat you differently based on what you really think you look like is important? So as we, whether we're thinking about equity or belonging, we can get more nuance about how much information we collect about race and ethnicity. Last thing I'll say real quick before I take your hand is there are some police jurisdictions that are starting to have police officers fill out the report to say what did they think a person's identity was before they had that encounter. It's fairly controversial because some people are worried that this officer is going to project an identity of race or trans identity or gender on someone. But other folks want this because I understand what was in that cop's head before they interact with that person. And how did things differ, whether there's a difference between how people actually identify or just a difference between how people are treated based on the perception of the officer. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, so there's a question, and that's why I had the follow-up question to the very first question that you asked. I hope that wasn't confusing, right? Is race based on biology, right? And I asked, when did that change? Because originally it was created based on biology, right? Even though it was a false narrative. Okay. So the things that you just said on implicit biases that people show up with is based on a false narrative and old knowledge and information that, question, because often we hear that race is a construct. After how many years does that construct become reality? 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 400 years, right? So the question for me with what you say begin to change thinking. Policy that biology, it is based on, we recognize the socio-political move to stratify and to do different things, right? How do we get to changing the thinking of people?
Really good question. Now it's just our icebreaker. One of the things that we want to think about as we do this work, you all continue to do this work, and while again we're going to try to get at, well, what kind of indicators can we start to capture today? We also want to have that sense of what should we be collecting in the future, so we can have new indicators that can help us understand the realities of people's situation. I'll do one last thing, right? And when you're thinking about creating new ways to capture insights, those most marginalized by systems and those who have the worst experiences will get to the surface when you are doing the work of asking the questions. So a lot of talk about safety, and we'll talk about whether or not people feel safe when they go into spaces. And it would be easy for folks to therefore ask a question like, do you feel safe when you are at the hospital? Do you feel safe when you are at work? And some people might say, well, I'm not even going to ask the question, do you feel safe at the hospital? That's a silly question. Why would you even ask that? But for folks who have their sense of safety threatened so continuously that maybe they don't even think about safety in the same way as many others, maybe they start thinking about safety in the sense of, well, when I move into this space, will I be able to handle myself if something goes down? So when that becomes a reality, well, do I feel safe? Yes or no? It's almost like a threat to how you feel about yourself. And so you're going to say, maybe you'll say yes when we want you to say no, right? So there's a organization, I always forget the name of it, that focuses on trans folks, that has a group that focuses on trans women of color in particular. And they build a survey that goes out to many spaces across the country. And in their survey, when they're asking about people's experiences in the hospital, they ask questions like, how often are you confronted with verbal violence when you are in the ER? They ask questions like, how often are you confronted with physical violence when you are dealing with your primary healthcare physician? Are these questions that people would think that folks who look like us and who experience life like us in the room would necessarily think of when building a survey like that to try to understand people's experiences?
So getting, all the folks in the room who may be dealing with things very differently is important, and not saying, oh, well, only one person in the room is having that experience. So that question can't be that important. Sure enough, if a survey like that goes out to more people more broadly, I'm sure there will be more people besides Black trans women who will be checking. Yeah, sometimes I do experience verbal violence when I am dealing with my primary care physician, right? And suddenly we learn more. Now, what we want to walk through as quickly as we can is, oh, real quick, 2 questions. One, how many of you expect to be back for the afternoon session? Another question, how many of you work in Washington state government? Okay, how many of you have how many of you work in Washington state government? How many of you are in leadership roles in Washington state government? Okay, we're just trying to get a sense for like what kind of questions it would make sense for us to ask going forward. I want to check to see what people have said in the chat. Oh wow, they just said yes, and I am, and I don't see that in context with the question. I'm sorry. Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, if you signed up for this, I don't know what we want to call it, this set of sessions, then the first in the morning we were going to be dealing with 2 topics, in the afternoon a different set of topics. If people are coming back, then we won't do the pop quiz again. We won't go through some of the foundation stuff, and we can move more quickly in the next part, which is really why I'm asking. Not that anybody should think about coming or not coming, change your mind, this and that, but it'll just influence like how we move through really quickly now and what we do later. Yeah, certainly. This is like I don't know what the other sessions are really about. This is sort of a special session while folks are in the space to just get some much needed information. So determinants and indicators. Real quick, I'm gonna, I say real quick, but this thing is kind of long. I want to walk through really quickly what we work. Go ahead.
Thank you. As you talk about determinants, I'm wondering if the determinants you're going to be talking about are based on white people and white normative behaviors, or on other racialized groups with things particular to them taken into account or considered. What's the standard?
There are a lot of ways to think about that. What folks, you can't really pull it apart, right? Like you can't really pull the systems that we all talk about, and I sort of think about as this intersectional white supremacy. Can't really pull them apart because the systems are created around them, and while organizations like Race Forward that and the Government Alliance on Race and Equity that John Paul talked about today, while those organizations are playing a big role in setting a standard for what people think of as determinants and indicators, while that is the case, it's still connected to the work of government. So in some ways, we're trying to push and find ways to say, okay, well, what are we trying to determine? And what do we want to determine about how government is functioning, and what do we want to determine around how people are experiencing the results of the work of government. But it's all still sort of in some ways
rooted in the systems, right? Like we talk about, we're talking about the determinants and categories like law and justice. These are terms of the system. Whether or not we think that they're just English, they mean things to the systems. Housing, built in natural environment, like these aren't, this isn't language and words and thinking. These departments aren't agencies that sprung up post a realization of anti-racism. These are these structures that have existed before. So in some ways, we want to understand those structures, but also we want to understand the community.
And I would just add that, you know, these are the determinant categories. There could be other ones, but the indicators that we talk about today very much could, that's why we're all here, right? So we're going to lead that in. We could definitely have indicators that we have data for. And again, I know that we want to get to what we can measure today, but I also encourage us to have a list of indicators or things that we could think about that are decolonized, right? So I think that we're here today to co-create how we're going to measure these determinants of equity now and in the future. And so I want to make really clear, that's why I wanted to make a distinction, because we're going to want to do things that we might not be able to do today, but that doesn't mean we don't list it, we don't plan for it, and then we choose to move forward. Does that?
Yeah. So these categories changed not too long ago, but I didn't change them in these slides. I'm just presenting what we shared with the state a while back. So, you know, when you think about transportation and mobility, or when you think about community economic development or food systems or digital equity, the question in terms of indicator becomes like, what outcomes might people be experiencing as a result or an impact from those systems, or what conditions may be in community, you know, as it relates to that system, or because of the way the government is trying to fortify that system. And you know, when we think about state and local practices, how are people making policy, and what are they doing to ensure that policy is actually equitable? Now, as some examples of determinants that we came up with for other topic areas, so in the realm of early childhood development, we wanted to use the Washington report card, which is on kindergarten readiness, which is this resource of information and data that exists. And we picked a couple of the data points of the metrics that exist in that report card to call out number of domains, like number of domains of study that the kids are ready for. Is in this report. Percent of schools that report this information is in this report. Now, the percent of schools reporting indicator is an indicator of how the government is performing. How well are these government entities that we call schools, how well they are to be participating in this process here? The number of domains is more along the lines of what are they preparing the kids for, right? So in some ways we kind of get at what may be an outcome that directly relates to kids, and what may be an outcome that directly relates to people. In terms of the people population groups that we're concerned with, like the ways that we want to slice and dice this information, you know, we want to look at children under 5 and children from 5 to 9, and we want to look at that at the intersection of sex, as in sex assigned at birth, which is a data point that is available to us via the Washington State report card, intersecting with U.S. Census population data. We just want to run through examples of these indicators, right? Just to get it. Educational attainment. When we think about education, you know, there is data about educational attainment aggregated to many different categories and characteristics by the federal government via the American Community Survey, what we think of as the census. And we want to look at that in relation to race and Hispanic origin and sex. And we also want to look at that. Well, we want to look at it in accordance, those three, but also looking at how it differs for people based on communities that have a higher or lower poverty rate. So these kind of characteristics make sense. When we're thinking about education, we're trying to understand how well the state is doing as a government entity to influence the lives of people that we look at around the category of education, that we start looking at things like educational attainment, meaning the census has information about how many people, what percentage of community has only achieved above a certain age, right? Like over 25, what percentage of that community above 25 has only gone to the third grade or has gone to between the fourth and the seventh grade. I'm getting the categories wrong, but like maybe it's like fourth and eighth. And of course, how many people have a high school diploma? How many people have something equivalent to a high school diploma? How many people have the various level of degrees that we think of as college degrees above that? And how many people have professional degrees that are not exactly college degrees? So we've got all that data available to us. And so as a starting point, we decided to look at, to take this and turn it into two indicators, I do believe, one being percentage of the population that has achieved a high school diploma or less, population above 25. And the other percentage of the population that has achieved a college degree or higher. So a degree of some a level of attainment above high school or equivalent or above that. And we want to look at that at the intersection of race and ethnicity because we have enough data to be able to do that. Does that make sense? Like, does it make sense to do that? Does it not make sense to someone? Is somebody like questioning and wondering, you know, whether or not we should have used something else or has any specific ideas about that set of information? I'm asking mostly to get us thinking and talking about this, because then we're going to do this ourselves. We're going to do this in a set of groups that we need to figure out based on the number of people here. But you know, any questions, any thoughts from folks? Oh, I'm sorry.
And then they get it off and now, right now, not necessarily. So, but so the applies to both like for those who use those approaches. So we don't have to in that area. So what I can you pick up the right?
Oh yeah, they can't hear you on. Yeah.
Looked at it. Thank you. I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, and
Okay.
there's people online, just so you all know, there's people.
Oh, okay.
Can't hear us in the area.
I hear you. Sorry about that, everyone. So what I'm trying to say is when you all are talking about this, it's so interesting because when you say the indicators affect people differently, absolutely correct. Living in East Tacoma, I grew up School of Hard Knocks, you know, I'm very familiar with urban areas and I prefer to live in urban areas. You know, however, you know, when I decided to move to East Tacoma, it was a decision that I made based off of potential growth, investments that were promised by my council members saying that they were going to build up this community and essentially the neighborhood itself. I like
where my home was. Now, over the years, public safety issues have increased. And what we're finding is that our council is pushing those issues to the underserved communities. So the homeless encampments, oh, we can't have those in the wealthy communities. So let's push those over to the east side and the hilltop, because they've historically been, bad areas anyway. They're full of BIPOC people and they don't, they're up to no good, when essentially that's not the narrative anymore. A lot of us, we're second generation college students. My mom was a professor. And so, we've gone to school, we've been educated, and the community is changing, I guess. But there's still those parts of the community where they don't vote. They don't think it matters to them because historically their side of town hasn't even been looked at, On my side of town, the only thing that's over there are the projects, okay? So, back in 2004, they rebuilt the projects. Why did they rebuild the projects? To increase the amount of people that they can put on our side of town that may not be beneficial to the north end or the other wealthier areas in Tacoma. My concern is when it comes to this performative action, to this, saying one thing, but doing another thing, how do we address that? I mean, it's pretty much a slap in the face to me because, I voted for you and you told me you were going to do this for my community. And you're telling me now, well, we have to look at other communities. We have to do this. Now, public safety on the east side is down the toilet. It's awful. I hear shootings every night, street racing up and down 72nd. I have an encampment right behind my home that I've invested in. And, I understand that having a police presence and those type of communities causes anxiety. My husband is Black, 6'4", and I worry about him every time he goes out for work. So I understand the police brutality. But for me, I also have the issue, and it's affected me a little differently, of theft, vandalism, things like that are happening to my home, and people say, oh, well, it's just property theft. It's not that important. But what they don't realize is I live in a working class community. So if somebody steals my catalytic converter, that could be the difference of me getting to work and getting food for my family. And that's what they don't understand. Oh, it's a nonviolent crime. Oh, it doesn't matter. It does, because that middle class is being overlooked. Inflation, food prices are a lot higher. When we go to the grocery store and we use our budget, we're not getting everything that we used to get, but we're still working hard and trying to do the right thing. So when you live in a state that's liberal primarily, which is not a bad thing, but, the public safety issues are always pushed to the marginalized communities. How do you advocate for that? How do you force them to do what they said that they were going to do? I attend council meetings, but it's always like, oh, well, we have this homeless problem, but we're building affordable housing. Well, if you look at the rents around here for affordable housing, they're not affordable housing, 2,000 plus utilities, okay? So these individuals who are homeless, how are they gonna get off the street? How are they gonna move into these houses? Now it's like, well, let's look at co-op housing. Well, why didn't you look at that in the first place? Those type of things concern me, and I feel like it's affecting the resources that our communities need. In my neighborhood, the kids don't have sidewalks to walk home from school. They have to walk in the street. So I put in a request, can we get some sidewalks for the kids? Oh, you have to pay for that yourself. Now we're in a working class community, we can afford to pay for sidewalks, most of us anyway. So those are the things. It's like they put the onus back on us. And then when things aren't going well or there's crime, high crime, it's because of us. It's because historically that's how things have been. And so you shouldn't be concerned about that because you should be used to it. The East Side's always been bad for all these years. But no, it's a lot different now. It's a lot different. You think it's bad in the wealthier areas, it's like 10 times worse in the underserved areas. And I say underserved because we're not poor. We're not poor. The resources are not being invested into our communities like they need to be. And I advocate, I'm an advocate. And, I love where I live, but it's getting to the point where I just can't do that anymore. I have a 7-year-old daughter. You know, Tacoma with the education piece you talked about, you know, historically, the schools in my area, not good, don't score well, okay? So what Tacoma has done is allow parents to send our school, our child, so they don't have to deal with it. So they don't have to address the issues of the school. I'm sorry, I know I'm talking a lot and I apologize, but I feel like there are things that can be done, but they're overlooked or they're not interested because of the historical redlining and marginalization of the community.
When
Now, Tacoma has an equity index, which is a data collection of which areas are experiencing public safety issues, homeless issues. It's posted on their website and they know, but they still don't address it. And at the council meetings, you know, they say, oh, we're all about equity and we're going to make sure, and you know, the equity index, but it's not, the data's being collected, but it's not taken seriously. So how do we bridge that gap? We can collect all these data, we can set up all these indicators, they can collect all this information. Well, what are they going to do? They're going to decide what they want to do, if they want to do anything. And those are the issues that we're running into in our region, running into. Sorry, everybody. Thank you for letting me talk. I apologize. I can have a lot more to say, but for sake of time, and I love hearing you talk, I'm gonna.
No,
There you go.
but I think that's a lot of what's going on, right? And so there's a couple of things to unpack, right? So one is a lot of what you're are downstream effects from root causes. And a lot of times we are just trying to push the problem or push the people or deal with the downstream effects, as people might say, the symptoms of the real problem. We still have to do that. We can't just say, we're going to stop dealing with these people. We're just going to work on racism or sexism or classism. But I think that there's the notion to have this conversation that we do need to spend some time going upstream to try to solve those root cause problems so that we don't have people, because a lot of people that are experiencing, you know, homelessness or experiencing unhousing, you know, could be mental health. It could be, you know, lots of system breakdowns in their lifetime, right? So we're not here to blame the folks, and that's not what you were doing. And I know that, so I want to make that very clear. But we find that those folks are being pushed to places, and they're easily pushed to places where the power doesn't lie. So, and there's a lot of collecting data, but not taking action. There's a lot of, let's find out where the needs are greatest. Let's find out where the needs are greatest. Let's find out where the needs are greatest. Well, when are we going to start acting to where those needs are greatest? So the point of this, so let me just say a couple of things, just because I have a little bit of background about the plan and playbook, is that you need to invest where the needs are greatest. Invest where the needs are greatest. And also, there needs to be action taken, and there needs to be performance management around that. Great, you gave me an index. Show me how you're investing. And that's what we can hold them accountable to investing where those needs are greatest and being able to do that piece. And so when we come up with these indicators and the future indicators, because when we know, I want to be super clear, we're not collecting everything and looking at everything the ways that we need to be looking at it. And so that's why we're here today. And we're going to, you know, keep talking about this. But when we understand what that is, then we can hold them accountable to the action that needs to be taken. Like, why did you move the folks here? What are you actually doing to eradicate the problem besides just moving the problem from space to space? And I mean, you can't really speak to like an individual politician, like, well, I voted for you and now you didn't.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can have an answer for that piece. Yes. But if we have the places and spaces where the needs are greatest, and then we have, it's not just about saying, what are the determinants? Saying this is what we need to do as the solution. We need to work together. You know, we need government. We need our nonprofit sector. We need people. We need community to be able to be investing here. And when they're not investing that way, they might be talking that way. When they're not investing that way, then you could say, well, you know, your investment over the last whatever quarter, year, whatever, doesn't align with this work. Because a lot of the things that I've seen is showing where the needs are greatest. But we need to then move and mature to invest, showing the investment of where the needs are greatest. And that's what we need to hold. We need to hold people accountable for the actions, but we need to be able to show that. And so part of this, even though it does seem like, that we're looking at the determinants, it's like, we want to be able to show that, because I really love the belonging talk about how we're all together, like we're all connected, Ubuntu, right? We are all connected. I am because you are, and because you are, I am. And so when we have inequities, it doesn't serve all of us. All of us are affected by that. So we want to decrease the difference between the top and the bottom 20%. There is research that says the greater the inequality, the lower the outcomes of that region for all, and the less space between the haves and the have-nots, the better the outcomes are. And so the goal of this is not just to get the indicators, but to have policy maps around. Let's look to see how we're decreasing the difference between the top and the bottom over time, and how we're individual partners and people that can do this. Like I said, whether it's public, private, government, how are they investing where the needs are greatest to make this happen? So it's not a full out answer, and everything you were saying is great.
Yeah, I mean, it is, I'll say it's work, right? It's work, right? So work can be hard, it can be easy, whatever, but it's work, and therefore when it's work, you have to do it, right? What I was trying to hold in my brain while Nicole was talking was everything you said. So fundamentally, you said, how do we hold people accountable? That's what the indicators are for. They are there so that they're a part of the system of holding people accountable. She mentioned this notion of performance management. It is a process by which you determine how well you are performing as an organization. And if I'm McDonald's and I'm trying to make sure I am serving customers at a rate at a speed that makes sense and at a quality that makes sense. And so I measure that performance. We get surveys and we respond to those surveys, and there are tons of people reviewing that stuff and then going and talking to people and saying, hey, your numbers were down for this part of the work that indicates that your performance in this area is down. What are you going to do over the next month to make sure that number goes up? There's man, I'm so old. I have a hard sense of figuring this out, but for like, let's say 15, 20 years, I want to say there's this new philosophy in local government where they use performance management as a discipline to improve outcomes. It's been heavily used in the policing space. And in a lot of ways, all of the approaches that the Government Alliance of Race and Equity that John talked about today developed were sort of rooted in the idea that if people apply performance management to how well the government is performing in its duties to deliver these systems that sustain and allow the sustain communities and individuals and families and allow them to flourish, then you really can start to measure around topic areas. We're calling out topic areas determinants, down to indicators in any of those topics. And you named a bunch of them when you were talking. So you were, and this is the stuff I was trying to hold on to, but you talked about the sense of anxiety, right? Like if you think about the connectedness between that sense of anxiety as an outcome of, there was another outcome you described that was also, while it was still an outcome, it was leading to the sense of anxiety. You could think about inflation as a condition in a community, but the result of that is lower wages. The outcome of that is it could be lower wages, right?
Question with what you're saying right then, how do you measure and how do you keep track of anxiety felt by Black women?
I don't want to oversimplify that. How does McDonald's figure out how well they're serving them? They survey them, they ask. And alongside those surveys, they're actually tracking information about their performance in the system. So they can look at their quote unquote the performance of their activities data in association with the experiences that people have. They're not asking those questions, but in association with the experiences people are having. And that's the work. Like outside of local government, they talk about this as user experience, right? Like no longer are we just concerned with service and customer service. We're talking about even beyond the quality of service, the experience, how experiencing service, right? So some of these concepts are trying to make their way into not just into government, but into the work of community to make government more equitable. So if when the politician committed to folks in the community, I'm going to do these three things. We said, if you look at those three things that they described really as determinants or categories. I'm going to reduce crime. Okay, crime is a determinant area, but when you say reduce crime, which crimes? Which kinds of crimes will you reduce? What is that level of crime today? And so show me the metrics today. Show me how you're going to move them forward, and then tell me what actions you're going to take to reduce them. Right. So when we think about these indicators, they're just the metrics of things that you measure. And these indicators should be measurements of outcomes. They should be measurements of the kind of activities that the actions that people are taking, the investments that people are making. And they should be, organizations are doing those things. And then you have to come back to it. And I'm not going to say that this is exactly the problem with the Tacoma index, but sometimes the problem with the index is that it's broad. And it's too broad for the issues that you're trying to deal with. So you go into a conversation with a politician who who can't really change the scope of everything, who has influence over this part. Well, the index is sort of overlapping, kind of sort of suggesting some of those things. And so how can you use that index in that particular conversation? Maybe you can't. So you may need to create a different set of metrics, put that into a different kind of index that you're using to measure the effectiveness of that, that entity. Could be a politician, could be the governor, right? Like the governor's a politician, could be therefore the state, could be specific offices in the state. And no.
Can you hear me? Okay, it's really interesting that you say that because we recently got a new chief and recently they did. It's working. What I noticed is they had the indicators, they had all the things that you all mentioned, but they used what they wanted to use to skew it. So, we're saying that gunshots have increased, gun shooting, street racing, strong arm robbery, but those things aren't being accounted for because they've put in, they've said, well, if a bullet goes through a house and doesn't hit anyone, we don't count that. That's still a violent act, and they don't count that. So there's several times that has happened, and it's skewing the data. It's not giving a complete picture of what is really happening in our community.
Yeah, whenever I talk about the work of equity, I think about like 4 kinds of entities that are involved in this work. You've got communities that are trying really hard to explain that they're experiencing something, and they're very. You've got community organizations that have done some investigation, spam crazy, that have learned a little bit about how the systems work. And sometimes they don't frame it exactly as the community itself, as the community members themselves. But sometimes they frame some things in ways that for government or to do something about something. They miss some of the things that the community is talking about. They get some of the things, like some of the issues that the community is talking about. Where the issue is where like the issue is some policy that impacts economic opportunity for folks, but the community is saying they hate the traffic in the morning. And while the traffic in the morning is an issue and you can do things to control for the traffic in the morning, you don't actually address that other higher level issue. You'll just start to see the other things that actually are the effect of that. So like having community organizers reframe things or about the system can be helpful. Then you got the government, and the government is constantly trying to have an idea. And it's interesting, the government is always interesting because the government very often consists of people from the community. They literally work in the government, like because we serve, and very often government agencies require you to live there. A lot of people grew up in the space. A lot of decision makers didn't grow up in the space, and they have a completely different lens on it. I worked in government for 21 years. And all those things matter, right? So like government is now like saying, we heard you, community member, we heard you, community organization, and they say something completely different. Right. And then there's corporate entities who are thinking about their customers, or again, they're like well-meaning individuals who get into a space and have an opportunity and they say, I'm going to make a difference. And again, these feel like 4 separate conversations all around the same thing. It's like, yeah. Yeah. Say something. I can't.
Yeah, the one with the hand raised.
Hey Gigi, what's your hand raised? You wanna say something? There's a lot of conversation in the chat there.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Oh, okay, you're good. You just had your hand up from like a pool.
A long time ago. I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries.
And it keys up on a point that was made and that you were talking about is when you talk about collecting data, right? That data can be used positively or negatively, just depending on the intent of whoever puts it into action. How do we account for that and work not to let that happen?
Vote, stay active, push back, don't just accept it. It's just like all the obvious things, but not give up. You know what I mean? Like, because it's going to happen.
So follow up with that, right? Because you were also talking about
Keep using data yourself, collect your own data, collect it from your own vantage point, build your own data repository, tell your own story. Don't just not, I don't want to minimize that, but like everything you shared was really important. But when that can be transformed into data, well, now you can put it in front of someone in an aggregate. So it's not just you, and it doesn't seem like it's just your anecdotal story. But when you are looking solely to government to collect the data for me, tell my story for me, not enough, right? How ridiculous.
I guess I'm thinking about like some bigger context that we're trying to build here. We're trying to talk about what we. So in that, it's part of like how we're building that, there's like the data collection itself, but then the assessment and analysis. And then how that's communicated and then applied within the context. So that means that we need to have capacity and staff and maybe whether it's officers or programs that are maybe separate from those who have an agenda. So in cases of like maybe the police shouldn't be the ones who are analyzing their own data and telling that story. Like how do we build an anti-bias? I would like the neutrality, but what we really want is anti-bias, anti-racism. And so those systems, and then how is that represented? Also, there's a lot of best practices around like open source data accessibility, so that other kinds of partners in the system, advocacy groups, other partners are operating in ways and be working and partnering with them. So anyway, I know we're like really short on time. It's so interesting, but I just think that's something that we think about is like being intentional about this and then like who's represented and then how is that function so that kind of accountability.
Yeah, I wish somebody was here from the office that could describe how they intend to implement that. I don't want to misrepresent that. Real quick for folks who are going to come back, I want to go over the thing that we're going to do second. For those who are going to come back, which is like the goal of the competition. So I'm doing this in the wrong order. I should start. I guess out here when I look, but we want indicators of the individual, family, community outcomes that people experience, things that happen to people, the results of encounters, the results of interactions with services. We can think about that in terms of health, ownership, environment. Want to explore what the community looks like, what services are in community that are given that relate to that the state have direct influence over. It doesn't necessarily help to talk about things that the state doesn't influence. What other kind of resources might be available or could be available? What the environmental conditions might be, air, water, soil, condition of buildings, things like that. And then we want to go further upstream and think about the policies that influence those things, the programs that lead to those things, or can remediate those things, the services that entities within the state are responsible for, investments that folks make, where they when we think about investments, it's like, where do they build things, where do they give grants, where do they do perform maintenance, where don't they, do those things, and messaging. How do they communicate? And certainly we want to think about, are they communicating in languages that matter to those communities? Are they communicating through the means and modes that matter to those communities? But also, how are they communicating? What are they saying? What are some of the ways that they are saying things? I'm trying to read that question. How many people understood how to participate and were able to execute the instructions? Right. These are right. In some ways, you can think about figuring out these indicators in terms of the questions you want to ask and what would that answer look like, or the experiences and interactions that people literally have. I would love for you to come back and think about all of the kinds of things you said. Do we think that outside of this conversation, well, maybe someone would do this, but are counting the number of encampments on the table for Washington State and the various entities within Washington State? Because when you think about all of the things that an encampment of a certain kind might influence, whether it's a homeless encampment, or I don't know if they have this in Washington State, but specific drug encampments, counting incidents of nonviolent crime, certain categories that we may understand, not saying we, criminologists and sociologists may understand to be related to certain kinds of violent crime, or to be related to homelessness related activity, or drug related activity. How many of those, what kinds of things might those be, and how are they being counted, would be good questions to ask and give us a sense for where to go in terms of indicator. And while again, our goal will be to identify things that could be readily tracked, we shouldn't leave off the table the things that are yet to be measured, right? We should put on if there are things you want to put on the table, commentary you want to bring into this conversation. Definitely, I want to figure out how to translate everything you said into things that should be considered. Yeah, you too.
That's right. And then we come back and
Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep up with the chat. They're terrible job with that today. Wish I could. I can't share the chat.
So one final thing I'd like to just add or have us to think about, right? That as we're here thinking about and talking about equity and ways to do measures. Earlier you were talking about education and being able to measure where people are with the education, right? That they go past the third grade, that they get a high school diploma, higher education, right? And just reminding us that the educational in this country promotes white supremacy and inferiority of everyone else. So as I would imagine, most of us in here have lots of degrees, have we thought about how we have been indoctrinated in white supremacy? And because if we're not aware of that, then we can't undo it, right? And that's part of the purpose here. And then the data that's captured, the data that's measured, the way that we react and respond to that data is also then based on our education, which is based on white supremacy. So what kind of decolonizing work is being done to yourself?
I absolutely agree. I'm not trying to cut you off. I keep talking back and forth. I think that, like I said, these are the measures that we have. We need to be thinking about other measures, because I've been a manager for 30 years, which is kind of ridiculous to say. And I'm a supervisor or manager. And what I know is that it's not the degree you have, it's your ability to learn, your ability to do stuff. So when I think about measures of education and ability of workforce and things like that, are we starting to measure soft skills? Are we starting to measure other things? That's why we've changed for the equivalent of this with experience. So that, like I said, that was the big piece of me saying, like, we're going to talk about these things, but we also need to think about what else, or how do we want those measures to change so that we can get to that space of decolonization? Because we know right now, the data that we have has been based on the racist, heterosexist, system that we have there. So we're going to talk about what we can do and then what we need to do to move the agenda. So you're 100% on point. I've appreciated all your comments. And so when we come back in the afternoon, those are the things that we're going to want to talk about. And that's why I want to have space for both. And we can, they're going to be able to run the data on what we have. But I think that a big part of the report out will also be, we know that there's things we're going to have to do in a different way, and that we're not going to be able to do that tomorrow, but we do need to start planning for that today so that we will be able to do it, relatively quickly.
Like bottom line, like the state, if the state wants to measure something small, only measure things it has access to data for. And it can only measure at the state level things that it has access to data for that covers all of the counties, right? That covers all of the geographies. So putting that pressure further downstream to say, we need to think about things differently. These are the things that are important for us to track, or even finding the organizations that are already tracking some of that stuff and then lifting it up to the state to say, this is stuff where,
right. And starting with community, being able to do, like, when she was talking about, I was thinking like open data things, like where we're doing collection. There's lots of tools, but GIS is one of those tools where we can get those surveys to community partners and folks that are being able to do that. So again, when we come back, I do want to sit and think about envision what are the things we can do. Because I really think that's an important part of the conversation.
Yeah. Add location to your survey. And now someone's going to do something with that location information.
Well, very importantly, that what we are trying to measure, because that is not only that every other concern or every other things we are trying to measure. If we put our attention to major things are what we need to capture, but at the same time, we have to understand what is the impact of that measure, what impact we are trying to get it done. Because that is how you need to think about it when you are establishing measures. Because we always think that now my situation is this, and I want to get that resolved. So here is my measure for it. But we need to think ahead of this and saying that if this issue is gone, what is the next?
Yeah.
So not only trying to measure things is important, understanding that what is the impact of that measure and how I'm going to have a program which will make that impact. Yeah, have it. So that also is aspect. This is not just a talk things. It has to be very thoroughly analyzed and thoroughly put the measures in place so that we really deserve, so that our money we invest in the giving tax money to the government is really utilized. Otherwise, we are counting, measuring, and nothing is going to happen. So there is a very thin line between the measure and outcome. So make sure that we measure what we really want to get outcome from.
And we have a plan. As an oversimplification that a lot of people may relate to, gentrification happens when governments are trying to
make make communities look better, right? So when governments think of a community as just the geography and not the people, it says, oh, that community, that geography has these lower metrics. We want that geography to have higher metrics. That'll bring people with higher metrics into those communities. And so now those communities have higher metrics. Let's do things, and she points out, to move people out of these communities to other ones. So again, so like that community has higher metrics. And many governments have seen the urban planning best practices that lead to gentrification as best practice to create better cities and counties, right? So like really understanding not just what you're measuring, the process you're going to use after you've measured, what interventions you're actually going to perform, what you don't want to see as a result. All those things are really important.
So I'll stay behind if people have questions. We'll hopefully most of you guys will come back in the afternoon when we get to it, hopefully. And if not, thank you for your time.
Yeah. I wish you all had seen the chat. Really great conversation was happening there too.
I'm gonna say one thing. I think one thing that was super helpful is that we all
Good job.
have the
Oh,
microphone.
so I'm gonna be right.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to think if there's a way. I wonder if there's a way that one of them can monitor the chat and start keeping people online to get into the conversation. Sure. Someone's in your group. Yeah. Yeah, and then also help pass the mic around. So that I think that would be super helpful. Do you want to share this on there? Everybody can see it, but I don't know.
Oh, no, I just think you do it on there. Yeah, I'm really trying to figure it out.
Yeah, perfect. All you do is put them on the table and ask them or pass it out right now, put it on the chair, so they have to put it back. Is there microphone trackers?
All right, now.
Can you talk to the folks
That I can do it.
figure out how to like get it? Great. That's what I'm here for. Put the link in the chat. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
All right, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And do you need help? Yeah, no, I think.
At the end of it all, someone really.
Ideally, we should get here in the morning, maybe after. So we like the foundation. So we might have to. So we'll see.
And around.
To get to what we need to say, but it would be helpful if I knew. You know
What they do.
I mean,
But they don't necessarily think about it.
Right.
And then because they're not measuring for performance, they really don't.
Yeah.
Okay,
that sounds good.
They wonder why. It's a hiring program. Why is it have
Well, maybe there's a way to be on this one.
I just showed, and I.
I see it, yeah. Like saying.
They don't even know.
That's what I'm saying. So if he can sit next to
Let
me.
them go in and, it can't be that, right? Yeah, why?
Maybe I can do that.
Yeah, and then I don't know, it was sure. Yeah, and you could, yeah, and that's fine, and I think that's fine, but I'm also saying.
Even if it's like so. Thorough. I think it's some well
So
designed,
I think, can you use this
well
one?
defined data.
Well, that's the projector.
Those that-
Do we,
And then this-
so can we use
You can
that?
use mine, yeah.
Or I have another one.
So you can
Start
just-
getting people that have it.
It's whatever works.
I don't think I'm gonna need my computer.
Okay.
You can just sit next to me and then
Here, I'll show you.
yeah, I know how to do it. I was just trying to read the chat.
Oh, okay, so.
And that's
yeah,
why I
you
was
got
gonna
it.
have to have another computer, but if that can't happen, then, you know.
Right.
That you're working right, because that report that has to stay right down there. Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably not, do whatever, but we, yeah, we have extras if you want.
Okay.
Yeah, if you can just set up an extra one with the seat right next to me,
You got it,
then
right?
he'll be able to
You'll be able to do that.
Don't see that as much, everyone.
Yeah, let me find out what he wants to do. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think this is like
Or.
one part of a.
Like the metrics, so I used their worksheet that they were using and moving. I think this is relevant or no? I don't want to
So. I can definitely help with you. What do you do then? Because we have. Scan that.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's just fine. I just think there's not enough space for them to write stuff down.
Right, but I think that was for like whatever metric you all like decide on, just to like jot it down, and then for the second part, then they were gonna change whatever metric and whatever.
Okay, no, that's fine. And I think that they only had, in the session, in the thing, a few metrics.
Yes,
So they weren't gonna do all of those.
yes.
No, that's okay. It's fine.
And then this is the definition sheet that you said, okay.
Yeah.
For this. And for the. So be useful for.
I think we probably shouldn't do it.
Okay.
Just because, I mean, yeah. Let me see. Okay.
And then also.
Oh, you could do that. Yeah, you can.
Whichever.
That would probably be easier, right? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Then you can just.
I also have my laptop.
If we go over there, yeah, yeah.
You've got two spares and if you want to use yours.
Hi.
Oh, yeah, we can.
Oh, I already know. I was gonna say, like, this is an iterative process. This has to be an agile iterative process. Yeah. this is the thing.
Right after.
Okay.
Yeah.
The which word? Be that, okay.
Cool, yeah, I wanna make sure I eat.
Okay. Okay, okay, yes, you gave information, okay, very much a pleasure, but you're not coming, are you coming back this afternoon? Okay, good, I'll see you. Okay, yeah, this is the session, thank you. Okay, that sounds great, thank you so much. Okay, so she has this, and I don't think it's a bad idea, but I want to know like what you're thinking. I have one thought right off the bat before we go here, is that there's gonna be people who were here that are gonna be ready to rumble.
Are you saying we can't talk about this while we're eating?
But I'm trying to let her go, so
Oh.
she can go do,
Are you saying you don't want to eat with?
oh my God.
I'm being dramatic.
Yeah, you're being a Leo, is that what that is?
Here so that you can have our.
Okay, we can talk about, it. Okay, that sounds good, thank you.
You
All right.
are saying you don't.
Don't listen to him. Just ignore him.
I'm trying to ignore me too.
This is super
Oh.
cool. We're the directors, but so we are creating the new agency of Office of Independent Investigation. So we're
Oh,
the
wow.
first of its kind to you are now.
Yeah, I'm familiar, yeah,
Okay,
Yeah.
so
that's great.
this is it's like. It's like, if they're facilitating the bill, he's like, let's go. And I'm like, this is important. You represent the agency, stay here. I'm like,
Well, and what action are you gonna take? Like, what are they gonna
I
do,
know,
right?
but today is the day, Roger.
Oh, my goodness.
we're saying having access to, that part's always funny. We're saying have access to a space. What do we mean by a space? We mean a place, right? Not just some foreign concept or some high level conception of a world, but a neighborhood, a business, a specific part of a business, sometimes even a floor in a building of a business. We're always talking about space. And connecting the dots on some of what I was saying, like why the intersections matter, why you can't really advance racism without addressing all the other systems of oppression. Maybe that wasn't the thing explicitly said today. But I said that, from time to time people will see me and they'll say, he's a man. They'll think to themselves, he's a man. And in those situations, very often the benefits of sexism will start to pile up in front of me. Sometimes those people will see me, they'll say, oh, that person is young. And then the benefits of ageism will start to pile up. And then other times people will say, that's a young man. And then now they're like, oh my God, this person has lots of enthusiasm, I'm sure, full of potential, great ideas. And in some ways, that's a different set of benefits. But the reality is, being as Black, or a Black man, or a young Black man, some of those same characteristics that led to benefits in some of those systems are now leading to different kinds of burdens. I don't even have to explain them. Y'all know what I'm talking about. But I'll say some more things I won't have to explain. So you can imagine that if I'm traveling through, just walking down a neighborhood that's predominantly Black, my experience will look like one thing. You can imagine that if I'm commuting to work on the highway or on the side streets, going through predominantly white people, my experience might be something different. When I get to work, trying to navigate from one floor to the next, where maybe there's the elitist spaces and the less so elitist spaces, regardless of my title, people who haven't met me yet, maybe even for some people who have, my experience might be different in some of those other spaces. I'll say that when I'm traveling Europe, sometimes people will identify something about me and say, oh, that person's an American coming to spend their money here. Yes. Other times people will see me and say, oh, another one of these African immigrants coming to take our resources, right? So location always matters, and I think we get it. A part of what we say when we're saying, any racial group is not a monolith, or dealing with disadvantage is not monolithic. A part of what differs is differing when location is different. And there's lots of reasons why that's the case. So location matters, why geography and GIS matters. And like I said, those people are in the room. One of the simple moments that I've had watching TV on Hurricane Katrina, someone said, we know about we know about how many people are going to die, and I knew that when I was a GIS person, I knew they'd be using GIS. I know that. We said that the disaster response it brings GIS in a box. Sometimes before the Red Cross shows up, they're there. So they need to tell the Red Cross where to go. GIS people are always there. But I quit my job because the company that I work for is the company I work for. Felt really great about what they could do. And I knew that team would innovation. None of those people of color, period, not alone, Black, Indigenous, and a lot of us anticipated that COVID would have the kind of result it would have because we have this equity lens, and these folks did not. And we built the dashboard that Johns Hopkins used, and it took the longest time for someone to say, hey, should we put race into our analysis? While that data was always available, you deal with the doctor, they know you have already answered those questions for them before they will see you. You will have to have filled out those forms at one point or another. So they always had that information. Never occurred to anybody to the people in positions of power. And the interesting position of power is GIS professional, urban planner, right? So anyway, it's important to us to make sure that we're using geography in a way that will advance justice, that we're thinking about all the intersections of social characteristics at the intersection of place, as we think about how we help the state of Washington build an anti-racist space where people find belonging. Had a pop quiz. Won't go back over it, but we asked the question: are race and ethnicity based on biology according to the U.S. Census? Now we all know it's a social construct, but did the federal government think of it as a social construct when it surveyed you all in 2020 and 2010 and all the intermediary times in between? Some people were surprised to know that the government actually, not only do they call it a social construct, they call it a social political construct, right? So that gives you a sense for why it is designed for, to understand political agendas. We asked the question, were Middle Eastern people and North African people accounted for in the system? So when you think about the questions that you've responded to all these times that are sort of derived, from the census questions, do you see those folks represented? And some people were surprised to find that as far back as I want to say the mid-70s, Middle Eastern folks and North Africans have been included as white in the U.S. Census. So they are accounted for, and Middle Eastern folks got on that list because they sued the government for the right to be white. They didn't want these time. All the things that the Irish, that's a story. The last part is the government. But, I'm saying they didn't want to waste time dealing with what Irish communities and Jewish communities and Italian communities had to deal with to prove themselves as white. They figured they would use the political system to do that, and succeeded. How many ethnicity categories are in the U.S. Census? We asked the question. Some people figured there would be at least 20, right? All these people in the United States coming from all these different parts of the world, or there would be at least 10, or maybe at least 5, but there are only 2. And those 2 are really only one. And it's the idea that there are Hispanic or Latino folks, and then there's everybody else. We talked about why this category is separated from race, and the reality that while the country is getting, as we would talk about it, increasingly more brown, it is not getting right. It's a category that is increasing, the brown category that's increasing is the same category that is much more likely to choose white, or if they not because of how they feel, but because the category says, do you have origins in Europe? And if you think of yourself as Hispanic, then you probably think of yourself as having origins in Spain, which is in Europe, geography. Hispanic or Latino. Thank you, everybody. Anyway, so here is, if you want to look at the information from the Office of Management and Budget that sets the standard that the U.S. Census follows. You can scan that QR code. I'm talking slow about it. Okay, so QR code stays up on the screen. So all that was sort of like get us in conversation, get us thinking about data critically. And there are lots of data sets that are the result of the American Community Surveys and other surveys that have information about gender. There's a bit of data now about sexual orientation, age, ability, race, lots of stuff. Do we have the data that we need to determine the categories that we are working on? Community and public safety. It is a slew of other topics that I'm just going to talk about as other community resources. And I'm not sure how familiar are. No, what's a good question? Isn't familiar of a determinant or an indicator in the context of equity? Who is not familiar? Is that a put people on the spot question? I did it wrong. Okay, who is familiar? Okay. And I won't necessarily go over it in great detail, but when we're talking about determinants, we're talking about really like things that determine how people will the outcomes
people will ultimately experience in terms of health, education, economics, encounters with the systems that we talk about as the law and justice systems. And when we talk about indicators, well, the distinction we're making between determinants and indicators is that determinants are sort of like these big categories like health, education, while indicators are the actual measured things, the metrics. So in between indicators and determinants is still, let's say, data, right? So we may have data about educational attainment for communities across the land, but how do we turn that data into an indicator? Well, certainly there's data that says, you know, what percentage of the population over 25 in the country has achieved third grade or less for school, or sixth grade to fourth grade. That data exists. Well, we made a decision to simplify some of that and turn that data into two. What percentage of the population over 25 in a given census tract achieved a high school diploma or less? Another indicator being what percentage achieved a college degree or higher, right? So choices that we make to come up with an indicator that we think will give us some sense of how people are doing around the determinant area of education. Does that make sense? Was it too abstract? Someone shared a book that involved a lot of experiences in the real world that really laid out a ton of things that all many of which we could define indicators around. That's not helpful for folks who are here. Sorry. But I am trying to fast forward to get to this point. Anyway, so as we think about these indicators and these determinant areas, can you go back real quick? I'm going to say something that's not exactly on there, so it's like I didn't need it. Sorry. Let's say parks and recreation, right? So let's say parks and recreation is what they call it in Philadelphia, which is where I'm from. But I think it's parks here or recreation. So when you think about parks, we want you to think about this sort of framework of a community impact stream. We actually have a different version of this that is more of a cycle that has experience. But if you will sort of imagine that organizations make decisions, they do work, they have activities and actions that are typical, and those things can sustain or create structural racism or discrimination. They could sustain or create class, gender bias, other forms of bias. They can create or sustain lack of access to resources or power. They could sustain intergenerational inequities, right? So we want to create indicators that help us get a sense for, how the government's practices, how their decisions, their practices, their investments, their programs, their services, you don't have to remember that part. It'll be on another slide in a second. Of those things influence what's going on in communities that ultimately then impact what people experience in terms of results or outcomes. So when we think about parks and recreation, keep saying that parks are community assets that exist in the community. The condition of those parks we may be able to describe those as conditions, right? It's the conditions of those parks. So you might have a park or you might have a playground, but the basketball court is torn down, right? So you may have in your database that I got this park over here and all these people have access to parks, no problem. Well, what's the condition of these parks is a thing to think about. The quality of air, water, and soil around those parks would also be conditions that we'd be interested in. Wow. Yeah. Let me know really quickly if this is any better. Also, I may be doing this, which might be the problem, you know? Yeah, how does it sound for folks on the no sound? Okay, cool. All right. So government is making decisions about where to put parks, where to do maintenance on parks, where to put programming in parks, where to invest in more or less programming in parks. The parks exist as assets in the community. They may be near harmful conditions that make them less valuable in community. Because of the resources that are available at parks, you may have people who experience, you know, so you may have parks that kids are going to that maybe are near toxic air, water, or soil that may be causing folks to have health issues like higher incidence of asthma related issues, or you may have you may going in the other direction, right? So perhaps school attrition is an issue that you're dealing with, right? You've got a community where it looks like, wow, gosh, like so many kids are leaving school. What can we do about it? And maybe you spend all your energy just looking at schools. Well, some of the creativity we want people to be thinking about is, well, perhaps there is something that, to get back to park, you might do at a park, or do that leverages a park as a resource, or a park facility as a resource that could increase the likelihood that people stay at school. Maybe some programming that makes it fun, exciting, maybe helps people with their homework, you know, helps parents with homework with kids. You know, there may be things that you can do in areas that you may not otherwise think of as unrelated. You may think of as unrelated if you're not thinking about this sort of stream concept. And while, you know, maybe what I'm saying sounds obvious to folks, the reality is people very often in this equity work in cities around the country, they get stuck in one of these areas or the other. They're like, we got to deal with school attrition and just keep counting school attrition, or we got to deal with, you know, toxic lead in the soil. And it feels like, yes, let's focus in on lead, and eventually folks will get to, or what are the things we can do policy related to that address the lead, or root cause, what's actually putting the lead in the community. But you may have separate resources that are focusing on health issues that are related to the lead issue, right? And so these folks could be working together, or the data could come together on a map in a way that helps you see those connections, or in any other kind of data visualization. So we want you to be thinking about, you know, outcomes, community assets and conditions, decisions and practices. And we also want you to be thinking about experiences that people may have as it relates to certain outcomes, or experiences they have with or at the community assets, or in relation to the conditions in the community. Maybe my mother was a public health and safety officer for the Parks and Recreation Department in the city of Philadelphia, and her job was to make sure that the was really just to count and to care for people who are harmed accidentally at parks, and seeing the relationship between harm and the conditions of parks and where people were investing in maintenance was an important part of that work. So again, we want you thinking about how these things connect and relate, and helping us imagine indicators that we can define based on those things. Yeah. I think that's the recap, and oh, is it not? I mean, okay, real quick. So sometimes to like help people see how this stuff comes together. This is based on a study that folks have done in many different places. And this particular study was done in St. Louis. And what folks looked at was historic policies that were creating and sustaining structural racism. And one of the policies they looked at was redlining. So they mapped where the communities were broken up based on the HOLC categories.
And they also looked at heat, right? So they mapped the temperatures across the city of St. Louis, and then they mapped those in relation to, they mapped the temperatures in relation to the redlining data, and they could see that places that were hotter were also places that were red or yellow, and those are the categories of declining and hazardous as far as redlining was concerned. They also mapped this stuff in relation to outcomes. Some that might seem really obvious to you, like heat-related issues, respiratory-related issues, hospitalizations for cardiovascular, kidney, and respiratory disorders. They also looked at this stuff as it related to expenses. So if your neighborhood is hotter, and you're low income, and you can't afford an AC, right? Like, or you can afford an AC and now you have to run it. This is also impacting people's pockets even more. They looked at trees, where trees were and were not planted. They also looked at impervious surfaces, because again, when I was a kid, the news would say it was one temperature. I'd go outside and it always felt hotter. And you could see the heat radiating off the asphalt, and I thought it was in my mind. But no, asphalt is absorbing and reflecting back more heat than places that don't have it, right? So all those things matter. So when the news is saying the temperature is one thing, but it's something different in your neighborhood, it probably is. And maybe it's cooler in your neighborhood, maybe it's warmer. And so people have been using maps and spatial analysis to do this work, and the state of Washington intends to do the same. So there's lots of examples of how people have done this in different parts of the country. So what we're here to do today really is to think about, for these categories of law and justice, community and public safety, a bunch of community resources, including parks. What are some of the decisions and practices? So these are the things that are in that category: policies, programs, services, investments, grants, messaging. What are the community assets and conditions? So services that may be provided in community, resources other kind of resources that may be provided in community, environmental conditions, conditions of the resources and assets that are in community, and outcomes. The next slide is all of it. And outcomes. So when we think about outcomes, we want to think about the experiences and the results that people have as it relates to topics like health, education, economics, ownership, ownership of home, ownership of business, asset ownership in terms of money in the bank, and environment. So just to name a few, just to get you all thinking. I went really fast. How are you all feeling? Is there a sense that this guy up here is speaking nonsense? I don't understand what he's talking about. Or are people feeling like, oh, some of this makes sense and I think I can get it? Hey.
Hi, this is Yen Baines. You're making sense. It's just the tech has been a little bit tricky in terms of really understanding the questions that you might come to ask us, or any of the feedback that you are looking for. But I am, following the problem, the description of the problem, and I appreciate that.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for enduring the difficulties too. But about how many people are online, by the way? Did he really?
89.
Unexpected. We were thinking we would be dealing with like 50 people. So what we want to do is really break you all up and get you brainstorming about, as it relates to these topic areas, what are things that we know that Washington State has influence over, or is actually doing in terms of action, or could be, as we think about things in the category of decisions and practices. Maybe we'll
start there. Before I just decide we're gonna start there, raise your hand if you work for the state of Washington. Cool, I think we'll start there. I really want to know what services your agency offers as it relates to these topics. So we want to say honed in on these topics. What policies does your agency create or influence, as it relates to these topics? What programs or grants or opportunities making available? And harder perhaps for today, but thinking about messaging as it relates to some of the that may or may not be, or at least opportunities that the organization has to message or communicate around these topics. That's what we're going to do next. Now, what we're going to try to figure out right now is how to break you all up.
Got a question.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Oh, I just had one question. I want to be super clear on what the assignment actually is. Are we building an entire stream map from decisions and practices through community and assets and conditions to outcomes? Or are we focusing on one portion of decisions, practices, outcomes? Like, what exactly is the assignment that we're tasked to do? Thanks.
Yep. When we break you up, we want to give you, I'll say, 15 minutes to just focus initially on decisions and practices.
Greetings for our Zoom community. We're creating 4 breakout rooms for you all to engage and to have the same conversation that we're having in person too as well. We're breaking into 4 different groups as the facilitator has told us. The 4 groups that we have breaking out that you will see and we'll go into is going to be the first is going to be parks and recreation and natural resources, building natural. Group number 2 will be building natural environment and neighborhoods. Group number 2 will be law and justice. Group number 3, will be law and justice. And group number 4 will be community and public safety. And it will be broadcast here in a second for you all to break out into the groups as well. And please in chat, as the facilitator asked, if you're a part of the state entity, you can put it in the chat too as well. We're watching your chat. Thank you.
This makes like, so we got 4 groups, right? Okay. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody have any objections to, well, no, let's see how it works out. How many people want to do law and justice? That group one? I want to do it here. Okay, law and justice. We hope that you say here, the other 2 programs. Yeah. That's what I.
Parks, recreation and natural resources, and built in natural environment and neighborhoods.
Okay.
Okay, so this is
Thank you. Well, I don't know how they want. Yeah, they either. I don't know if they're, I don't know if they're truly looking people like actual physical space or not.
So basically, each of the virtual rooms,
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. Yeah, because there's.
then we can't do breakouts on. Everybody back, close them all.
Yeah. And is it Andre? Is that right?
Hold on, oh, I bet you they do this. Hold on, I want to do this. I like to watch it. I got those. I have to.
Yeah.
Are you doing this?
Real quick, we've been trying to request some additional support in the community and public safety group because we're having some questions about how we can actually get help. Is there anybody who can jump over and give us better direction?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, give us 1 second. This group can hear me because I'm gonna have to bring them.
We also have the same request in the neighborhoods breakout room if someone can come help us there.
We're asking everyone to go out so we can have full participation if you all hear the breakout in the Zoom. Give us 1 second. We'll check you all for the first 2 breaks. For the Zoom community, as we work on our next steps and how we want to, I'm gonna bring everyone back in. Usually bring everyone back into one space. We're gonna bring everyone back into one space. I'm gonna close all rooms. All rooms are being closed. You all should be able to come back into the space. And as you all gather and come back into the space, we'll be able to give more clarification and direction as to what is the next steps. Because you allow, this allow you to see people like that. So,
Yeah,
greetings all, we're getting it set for the Zoom community. Happy to have you. Thank you for the grace and the patience once again. Yes, we're gonna get you some directions and some assistance. That's one step. And then do we have a camera for them to get see me actually talking to them? Does that camera work? I know.
We can do that, the only thing with cameras is that that's gonna affect the audio.
Oh, no, I want to.
Yeah, so, yeah.
I'm all right.
Yeah, that's the only problem. So actually, you probably request everybody to go off.
Well, I
Kind
can
of
be, I
with this
want to, we have to do it for you soon, so. Let me stop. For them.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's just that if there's a bunch of video, then that's. Then you won't be able to hear as much. Yeah, it just causes kind of like a network jam with this many people. So we can have video, it's just then you're sacrificing sound quality. Unfortunately.
Just checking, all of the groups were pulled back to the main room. We're not sure if that was the intention. It didn't feel like 15 minutes.
No, you are correct. Whoever that is talking, that is correct. We pull everyone back into this room due to the fact that we created breakout rooms for you all. And we have the same 4 breakout rooms for the folks here in space, in the actual space with us. But with that being said, you don't have 4 different locations for to have different breakout rooms people join. So we're gonna keep you all here together as one. And then get some more clarification on what we need to do with you all in this space. But you just give us 1 second. They work with because there's not a facilitator.
And you're good on that. Yeah.
I'm looking at a person. And hey, can you all hear me? Cool.
So here's what we want you all to do. So for the folks who work for a government agency that does work that's related to the topics that you all are focused on, right? For the topic that you go into, we would love for you all to maybe take the lead in terms of defining the types of work that you do, types of services that you offer. When you think about the mission of your agency, and it may be something like to ensure public safety, right? How do you ensure public safety? Like, what are the areas that are fulfilled as areas of work to get done? Maybe it's easy to think about this in terms of the hierarchy of the organization, because maybe it's broken out by division or unit that corresponds to a type of work for some of it. Certainly there'll be cross-cutting things like human resources and things like that. But what are the sort of business areas that you all work on, or the areas underneath your part of government that deliver certain kinds of service, either direct to citizens or students, or that deliver services to other agencies so that those other agencies can do what they need to do. So if you all can sort of take the lead in terms of listing out the types of services you provide or work that you do in sort of big categories, not as big as public safety, but maybe it's as specific as state police patrols, right? Patrolling is a service that police do, but also public education may be a service that law enforcement agencies are providing. They may also provide as a service, officer related education, right? So that the officers are trained. So, is that making sense to folks?
Would you just like to do like a roll call and have us introduce ourselves and what we do?
Yeah, you should definitely. Sorry, when you break out into the breakout groups, meet each other. That should have been the first thing we said. Share your name, a little bit about yourself. Yes, for sure.
I'm not seeing any breakout room on my screen right now.
Are you ready for the breakout? I just want to make sure that folks are sort of get what they're supposed to do and are ready to get into it.
It would be really helpful if we could have just some bullet points about what to talk about so that we can reference them in the breakouts.
Okay. They will not show up in the breakout if I chat them here, right? How do we?
If you chat them before we leave for the breakout rooms, they'll go with us.
Okay.
Sorry, but I don't see the icon for the breakout rooms. Where are they?
I think they're still putting in a list of what questions we're going to be considering in the breakout rooms before they send us on our way.
Yep. Sorry, I was in the middle of writing.
Oh, perfect. I thought that I had to find it. And I couldn't.
Thank you all for figuring this out.
The thing about projection. I'm glad I was like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna mill around. I'm gonna pop in and out of places.
Good afternoon.
The breakout rooms no longer have names, so can you tell us which room is which topic? Hi, Tim.
Hey, which room is this name? Because when I come back, I want to make sure I got the right one. Your connections today are they're not all working. They're confusing. So, but I'd like to come back to this one to participate. What is it called again? Hello, is someone there?
So if you go into a breakout room, when the breakout closes, you'll come back into the general session.
What I'm asking you is, here, help me out with this. So we're gonna come back at, is it 2:10 or what is, let's see, you're saying, yeah, 2:10. So I just want to, here's what happened. I came across this link. I was surfing the links for the afternoon. This is the only one that worked for me. There was another one, but it just didn't sound interesting. It was poorly organized. So I'd like to return back to this one when I come back, go out and return. I just hold on here. You guys going to kick us out, and then we just automatically come back at 2:10? How's that going to work?
We'll still be in the same meeting, but once
Okay.
breakout rooms are closed, we'll all be brought back into this.
So just stay
larger
here,
meeting.
and then
Yeah.
it'll be automatic.
Yeah,
Okay, cool. Thanks.
yeah, you don't need to sign back in.
With the breakout rooms, once again, first breakout room is going to be law and justice. The second breakout room is going to be community and public safety. Room number 3 is going to be parks, recreation, and natural resources. Number 4 is going to be build and natural environment neighborhoods. There's 4 breakout rooms. Down at the bottom, you should have an option on your Zoom space to join a breakout. There's 4 boxes down below next to live trends. Should be. Okay, no worries. Thank you, Shane.
Well, I think if we-
Hello. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Hello, we are doing a sound.
Still coming a little garbled.
Do you want me to keep talking?
Only if you want to.
Here, maybe I'll. Laying the foundation. Determinants of equity worksheet. This is a sound test, by the way, so we're trying to read off something. Distributional equity, fair and just distribution of benefits and burdens to all impacted parties and communities across the record. Okay, you want me to keep going or? Yeah. Sorry.
Greetings to our Zoom community. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Can we see you?
Yes, I tried to make sure to turn on the camera here. Let me see. Folks are joining in. I want to make sure to give people folks time. Breakout rooms are closing in 10 seconds. Welcome, greetings. Good to see you all. Okay, as the members of our community come from that are here with us, before they come in, definitely want to give space to you all here in the Zoom space to be ready to maybe share out of the 4 breakout rooms. If there's something that you want to share that was pivotal in your conversation or something that you just want the whole community to know, if you don't mind putting that in chat, you can do that, or putting in chat that you would like to be unmuted when we all come back to share. So either share some points via chat from your group. You can put your group that you were in, maybe a point or two that resonated with you all in your groups. Then we can share some of those out to when the community that's here with us in person gets back to as well. I should maybe say, yes, I agree to hear about all this work that is happening. And thank you all for the grace and patience as we try to maneuver through a hybrid situation. Glad to have you. So once again, if you would like to share in chat, maybe a point or two that you've taken from your group when you went into breakouts, so we can be ready to share when everyone comes back in. Do we have somebody from group 1, from our first group, that maybe want to put a point in or share when the group comes back? If you want to share when the groups come back, if you could put your name in the chat, if you would like to do that. Group 1 back. Right. Yes, thank y'all. This is so our community in person is coming back right now. Thank you, Faith. You're sharing for group 2, so I'll let them know. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I want to. Do we have someone from either our group number 3 or group number 4 that'll be willing to share a point or two as we get ready to come back in? you don't mind being vulnerable to volunteer to share, that would be nice. No pressure, not. We have already faith, I believe in. Is someone sharing from group one? Is that where you trying to get to it? Sharon, are you sharing on behalf of group one?
I joined the group late, and so I only heard a couple people share out, and so preferably not. I just, but I wanted to let you know that we had returned.
I appreciate you sharing. Thank you. No worries. We have at least someone from group two. Okay.
Hi, I'm Faith Brantley, and I'm with Push for Dreams. And something I took out of my group that I really enjoyed was the penitentiary, on how they focused on the incarcerated, as well as helping people come back into the world, as well as coming back into the world and getting on their feet and making sure they can be as successful as other people.
Now that most of us are back, it would be good if we could, man, I can't remember the groups, but maybe get a couple of the groups to share back some things, like for one, just a sentence on how you felt the process went for you in the group. And, you know, one or two examples of services that you identified. And if some groups went further and they started to think about indicators, maybe you could share some of that too. So just, you know, how it felt, you know, some of the services you identified, and if you went a little bit further, what did that look like? Maybe 30 seconds from somebody from the folks who, I guess nobody stayed in the room, is no problem. From law and law and justice. Anybody from law and justice want to share?
So that was Law and Justice.
Oh, only online, yeah. All right. Sorry, law and justice in the room. Wow, I sort of described that as if you all didn't exist. I apologize for that. Okay. How about anybody from community and public safety who were on site? Anybody want to share out from that group? Thank you.
Community and public safety, process-wise, I felt as though that we could have definitely had a smaller subset of the group would have made it a lot easier, because within the group, we had multi-agencies with thousands of employees. We also had much smaller entities, and our services were so broad and so encompassing that it was difficult to really pare down how we could parlay that information into something actionable, and definitely parlay it into some type of indicator. So process-wise, I think smaller focus would have been easier to sort of manage and manage the messaging around, you know, what's the outcome, what are we seeking to do, what's the goal of this, and what's the objective. In terms of services, we had incredible broadness of the services we provide, all the way from licensing and education to consultation, to technology. How do I say it's the technology? How do I? I'm looking at my partner over there. Like community technology access, and then some of the tools that we had were, you know, all over the place. Community engagement, community voice, We had, major file systems for tracking like data warehouses. So once again, like just an incredible expanse and broadness of services and tools that we all worked on. Thanks.
Anybody want to share out really quickly from recreation or natural resources or built environment? Any of those?
Let's see, that's easy. Good afternoon, everyone. I thought our conversation went really well, perhaps because we were all state agencies that measure environmental indicators. I think our conversation really focused around the measures and less about the services. So we had Beaches on Partnership, we had Department of Ecology, and we had Recreation Conservation Office. So while there's kind of data gathering and reporting, both geospatial and other sorts of indicators in partnership perhaps with Department of Health, like the health disparities map. A little bit of conversation around the permitting responsibilities that a lot of these environmental protection agencies and coordinating entities have. But yeah, I think we focused more around how could we measure that there could be disparities. But I invite anyone else who is part of the conversation to feel free to add.
We split off into two groups to talk about natural resources, and our conversation trended a lot more, I think, less away from quantitative measures to community voice and impacts of engagement in state agencies, and how when we engage a community, that can have dramatic impacts in the types of services that they then receive as a result of the information shared by those community members. So I'm just thinking a lot about the importance of community voice and engagement, authentic engagement. Thank you.
Cool. I missed some of the sharing online. Anybody, now that we have the full group back in the room, anybody online wanna share out again, or share out who didn't share before?
This is Natalia. I can share a little bit on my comment. I thought it was really interesting because for such a wide range of the different agencies and administrations we work for, we all kind of related to healthcare, which is my expertise. But we had somebody from the Department of Health. We had somebody that does, health advisory. We had some people from some upper level educational institutions, and we kind of all were a little bit related in how we all help the community.
So I think it's a shame if we didn't share. So we did law and justice as well. And so my name's Jane Nesbitt, Office of Independent Investigations, Chief of Staff. And so we did WSP for Service of Education, Law Enforcement. They step out for opportunities with the investments, and great suggestion was made on percentage of vendors from year to year, using suggestion of Ubambi. So hiring metrics on ethnicity as well. So the lens we would use is like pro-equity, anti-racism, universal access and belonging. And then another measure was another agency, Ombuds Corrections, and they are a new agency as well in dispute resolution, and that's a program. And the metric with data and was very vulnerable in talking about this. There's just lack of data, and looked at the policy changes that could be implemented on the measure on impact on society. The lens would be used on belonging. I do that too. I could just move my head, not be in the microphone. And then last would be our measure for Office of Independent Investigation. We have a program of doing independent investigation. We have a service to family liaisons. The metric we would use would be our family engagement and satisfaction with the process. Thank you for that, rather than the outcome. So the lens, of course, would be all of it. So pro-equity, anti-racism, universal access and belonging. And we would be using that as a priority and an investment. Okay, thank you.
And thanks everybody for participating. Now we're gonna do the struggle part, the other struggling part of trying to turn all of this feedback from you all into something that we can practically use to start to measure, and then maybe also something that we can use to help set direction for what the equity office does in partnership with all of you and the agencies that you all were speaking for or about today. So if you feel like you captured something and it's not on one of these white boards, not whiteboard, one of these pieces of paper, if you could come up to Nicole or I after the session and share, or if you're online, if you could post it in the chat. We're gonna save the chat, or at least save the content from the chat before we shut down the chat. Anyway, any other questions or comments before we close out? Should it?
So I know we have a lot of people on Zoom right now, and we just wanted to come in and say thank you so much to Nicole and Clinton for coming in and facilitating this topic for us from the Office of Equity, Washington State. We just want to say thank you. You all can clap again.
Question was, if you all have links or other electronic resources that you want to share, do we want that? Yes, we do. How do we want that? Thanks everyone. Give yourself a round of applause. That was not super easy.